The night a casual insult became one of the most unforgettable moments in entertainment history began with velvet curtains and the scent of expensive perfume hanging thick in the air. The Metropolitan Opera House glowed like a jewel box that autumn evening in 1952, its golden tiers packed with New York's elite, their diamonds, catching the chandelier light as they settled into red plush seats. On stage, a tenor's voice soared through an aria with crystalline precision, each note a testament to years of European training and aristocratic patronage. But in the shadows of the wings, a young man watched with an intensity that burned through the darkness. Sammy Davis, Jr. stood perfectly still, his slight frame nearly invisible against the heavy stage curtains, yet his eyes reflected something the audience couldn't see. At 26, he was already a seasoned performer, his name growing in the nightclubs and variety theaters where jazz and tap dancing ruled the night. But here, in this temple of high culture, he was merely a guest, invited backstage by a mutual acquaintance who thought he might enjoy witnessing opera's grandeur. His fingers unconsciously kept rhythm against his thigh as the tenor commanded the stage with the confidence of a man who'd never been told he didn't belong. The music swelled toward its climax, and Sammy felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that mixed longing with something deeper. The curtain fell to thunderous applause, and as the audience rose in appreciation, the tenor emerged from the wings, his chest still heaving with artistic triumph. His eyes, bright with the rush of adulation, landed on Sammy standing quietly in the shadows, and something flickered across his face, amusement mixed with contempt. He approached with the leisurely confidence of a man accustomed to being celebrated, his European accent thick as honey as he addressed the young performer who clearly didn't belong in this gilded world. "Ah, the song and dance man," the tenor announced loudly enough for nearby stagehands and musicians to hear, his smile sharp as crystal. "Tell me, do you even understand what you just witnessed, or is your experience limited to, how do they say, scat singing?" The small crowd that had gathered backstage chuckled politely, their discomfort palpable, yet their silence complicit. The tenor gestured toward the stage with theatrical flourish, his voice dripping with false generosity as he issued his challenge. "Perhaps you'd like to try some real singing for our distinguished guests after intermission," he continued, his eyes glittering with malicious certainty. "Unless, of course, you prefer to stick with what your people do best, entertaining in the smoky rooms where technique doesn't matter." The words hung in the air like poison, and Sammy felt every eye upon him, waiting to see if the variety performer would recognize his place. But something ancient and powerful stirred within him, a dignity forged in countless moments of disrespect, and he met the tenor's gaze without flinching. The tenor's words should have sparked anger, but instead they unlocked something deeper, a door Sammy had kept sealed since childhood. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in this grand theater anymore, but sitting cross-legged on worn linoleum in his grandmother's cramped Harlem apartment, watching her weathered hands cradle vinyl records like sacred texts. She'd close her eyes as Caruso's voice filled their 3 rooms, her lips moving silently to Italian words she didn't understand but felt in her bones. And young Sammy would watch tears trace the map of her struggles down brown cheeks that had seen too much hardship to count. Night after night, he'd fall asleep to those soaring voices, letting them carry him beyond tenement walls and the weight of everything his skin meant in this world. While other kids dreamed of being cowboys or baseball players, Sammy harbored a secret so fragile he never spoke it aloud, that someday his voice might touch the same heights, might prove that beauty belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. His grandmother never lived to know he'd spent years studying privately, sacrificing money from variety shows to pay an aging vocal coach who saw past color to potential. Now, facing this sneering tenor and his assumption of limitation, Sammy felt his grandmother's presence like a hand on his shoulder. The choice crystallized with absolute clarity. He could walk away and confirm their prejudices, or he could honor every sacrifice, every secret lesson, every night he dreamed in arias while the world insisted he belonged only in shadows. The walk from backstage to center spotlight stretched longer than any mile Sammy had traveled. Each step echoed against marble and mahogany, a countdown measured in heartbeats that thundered, louder than the murmurs rippling through the crowd. Diamonds glittered at throats that had never known hunger. Champagne glasses paused mid-sip as eyes tracked this intruder in their sanctuary of refinement. He felt the weight of their judgment like physical pressure. Society women clutching their pearls, critics already composing dismissive reviews, men in starched collars exchanging knowing smirks that said this boy had forgotten his place. But Sammy had spent his entire life on stages that didn't want him, reading rooms that had decided his worth before he drew breath. He'd performed in clubs where slurs floated through cigarette smoke, danced in theaters where he couldn't use the front entrance, smiled through applause from hands that wouldn't shake his. This crowd saw a novelty act, a jazz singer playing dress-up in their world of high culture. They saw his brown skin and assumed limitation, saw his background and predicted failure. The spotlight found him at center stage, hot and unforgiving, illuminating every detail. For their scrutiny, somewhere in the wings, the tenor waited for vindication, for proof that some doors should remain closed. But as Sammy stood there, facing their skepticism like a wall of ice, he thought of his grandmother's tears and those sacred records. He'd spent his whole life proving he was enough. Tonight, he'd prove artistry had no color. The first note emerged not as sound, but as transformation. A single sustained tone that carved through doubt like light through stained glass. Sammy's voice rose from somewhere deeper than technique, carrying the weight of Caruso's ghost and his grandmother's prayers, each syllable sculpted with precision that years of secret practice had forged in silence. The whispers died instantly, champagne glasses frozen in elegant hands, as that impossible sound filled every gilded corner of the theater with undeniable truth. This wasn't imitation or audacity. This was mastery, speaking in a language they thought belonged only to them. As the aria built, his voice climbed with volcanic power. Each phrase a declaration that talent recognizes no boundaries drawn by prejudice. The technique was flawless. Breath control, learned in smoky nightclubs, merged with classical purity, studied on scratched records played until dawn. His brown hands gestured with operatic grace, while his soul poured jazz emotion through Italian words, creating something neither world had witnessed before. The elite audience felt their certainty crumbling, their assumptions exposed as the poverty they truly were. The high notes soared impossibly, hanging in the air like accusations against every closed door and whispered slur. Women clutched their husbands' arms, critics leaned forward in stunned silence, and somewhere in the wings, a tenor's smug smile collapsed into trembling recognition. Sammy wasn't bridging two worlds. He was proving they'd always been one, that artistry flowed through veins regardless of the skin that contained them. The opera star's face became a canvas of catastrophe, each muscle betraying the collapse of his worldview. His jaw slackened as Sammy's voice swelled beyond what prejudice had told him was possible, the smug curve of his lips straightening into a tight line of disbelief. He gripped the velvet curtain until his knuckles whitened, watching this man he'd dismissed command the stage with authority that made his own recent performance feel hollow. The conductor's baton nearly slipped from trembling fingers as recognition dawned. This wasn't merely good. This was transcendent. Around him, the classical elite experienced their own reckoning, assumptions shattering like dropped crystal. The soprano who'd laughed at the challenge now pressed her hand to her throat, feeling inadequacy. Bloom where certainty once lived. Fellow performers watched their gate-kept kingdom expand beyond recognition, realizing excellence had been waiting outside their locked doors all along. The opera star's eyes glistened, not with anger, but with the terrible beauty of truth arriving uninvited. As Sammy reached the climactic phrases, the tenor, stumbled backward, his superiority revealed as the costume it always was. He saw his own limitations reflected in this impossible performance, understanding that while he'd inherited access, Sammy had earned greatness. The mockery he'd offered now sat bitter on his tongue, each soaring note a gentle devastation. Pride and shame warred across his distinguished features as applause began building like thunder. The applause began as scattered thunder, then became a deluge that shook the chandeliers overhead. Bodies rose from velvet seats like a congregation witnessing resurrection. Tuxedoed men and gowned women surrendering to something larger than their carefully curated world. An elderly Italian woman in the third row stood trembling, tears carving rivers through her powder as Sammy's final note unlocked memories of Napoli streets and her mother's lullabies. She clutched her pearls and whispered prayers in her native tongue, grateful that someone understood the sacred language of her homeland's soul. The ovation rolled through the theater in waves, each crest higher than the last, as if the audience needed to physically expel their astonishment. A young usher, barely 16 and invisible in his uniform, felt something crack open inside his chest, proof that boys like him could dream beyond what the world prescribed. White gloves meant for polite approval now clapped until they risked tearing, propriety abandoned for raw recognition. Sammy stood center stage, chest heaving, vulnerable in his triumph, letting their acknowledgement wash over him like baptism. In the wings, performers who'd spent lifetimes perfecting their craft found themselves weeping without shame, witnessing art that demolished the careful boundaries they'd constructed. The opera star covered his mouth with both hands, tears streaming past his fingers as humility arrived like grace. This wasn't defeat, it was liberation from the prison of assumption. The theater had become a cathedral, and Sammy its unexpected prophet, reminding everyone that greatness recognizes no gatekeepers, only those brave enough to claim their inheritance. The opera star stood frozen in the wings, his carefully constructed armor crumbling like ancient parchment. When Sammy finally descended from the stage lights, drenched in sweat and revelation, the maestro stepped forward with trembling hands extended. His fingers, which had gestured through a thousand arias, now reached across an invisible chasm his own prejudice had carved. "I judged you by everything except your voice," he whispered, his Italian accent thick with shame and wonder. "You showed me the poverty of my vision." Sammy gripped those offered hands, feeling the calluses of shared devotion to an unforgiving art. No anger lived in his acceptance, only the quiet dignity of a man who'd carried invisible weight for so long that grace had become reflex. "We all got our own roads to the mountain," Sammy replied, his voice still carrying operatic resonance beneath the jazz-smooth cadence. The maestro nodded, understanding that some lessons arrive wrapped in humiliation, delivered by those we least expect to teach us. Other performers gathered around them, a circle of witnesses to transformation nobody could have scripted. The boundaries that separated classical from popular, white from black, legitimate from entertainment, dissolved in the oxygen-thin air of genuine artistry recognized. A soprano who'd barely acknowledged Sammy's presence earlier now touched his shoulder with reverence, her prejudices evaporating like stage smoke. They stood together in the sacred disorder of breakthrough, where old certainties die so truth can breathe. The theater's backstage became a chapel of unlikely communion, where respect was finally divorced from skin and pedigree. Sammy had done more than sing beautifully. He'd shattered the comfortable lies that let people sleep soundly in their segregated worlds. The invitations arrived like spring rain after drought, each envelope carrying weight beyond paper and ink. Metropolitan Opera Guild soiree that once would have turned Sammy away at service entrances now requested his presence in gilt-lettered script, his name spelled with careful respect beside benefactors and patrons. Carnegie Hall extended bookings for experimental evenings where he'd weave Puccini between Porter, demonstrating that genius recognizes no borders. The performance had cracked open doors, welded shut by centuries of assumption, creating pathways where only walls had stood before. Within months, Sammy found himself backstage at venues his ancestors could only have cleaned, yet he carried their dignity in every step across marble lobbies designed to exclude him. Symphony orchestras in Philadelphia and Boston requested collaborations, their conductors curious about this. Artist who refused categorization's comfortable prison. Society columnists who'd previously dismissed variety performers as mere entertainers now wrote breathless profiles analyzing his technique, his training, his impossible bridge between worlds. Each invitation represented hundreds who'd witnessed that night whispering to friends, colleagues, gatekeepers, until whispers became mandate. The ripple extended beyond performance halls into recording studios, television appearances, conversations in homes across America. Young black performers watched Sammy navigate spaces previously forbidden, understanding that he'd shifted something fundamental in the nation's imagination. He'd proven that excellence transcends the boxes society builds, that artistry flows through any vessel courageous enough to claim it. His grandmother's opera records had planted seeds in Brooklyn darkness, and now those seeds bore fruit in light nobody could extinguish. The footage flickered to life on a laptop screen in a modest practice room discovered by a conservatory student named Marcus, who'd been researching performance history. Grainy black and white images showed a slender figure in a spotlight, and then the sound emerged through decades of silence. A voice that shouldn't exist, bridging worlds that supposedly couldn't meet. Marcus watched transfixed as applause thundered through crackling speakers as faces from another era wept openly, as one man proved that talent recognizes no boundary except the ones we build ourselves. He replayed it 7 times that night, each viewing revealing new layers of courage compressed into those 3 minutes of defiant grace. The performance became Marcus's talisman during auditions when panel members glanced at his application with assumptions already hardening. He'd remember Sammy walking onto that stage, facing an ocean of doubt, choosing to sing anyway, to pour everything into notes that would either liberate or destroy him. That choice echoed across generations, giving permission to every artist told they didn't belong, every dreamer informed their aspirations exceeded their station. Sammy hadn't just sung opera that night. He'd rewritten possibility itself, proving that excellence demands recognition even from those desperately wishing to deny it. Years later, Marcus would stand on similar stages, carrying forward what Sammy had begun, understanding that every note was both performance and testimony. The grandmother's opera records had traveled further than anyone imagined, their melodies now sung by voices she'd never hear but had somehow always known were coming. Sammy's legacy lived not in recordings or reviews, but in the quiet courage of artists who refused limitations, who remembered that one man once silenced mockery with beauty nobody could dismiss. His song continued in every throat that dared to challenge what the world claimed was possible. The footage still plays somewhere tonight, reminding new generations that artistry transcends every cage we build, that dignity cannot be denied when matched with undeniable skill. Sammy Davis, Jr., had walked through fire and emerged holding light, and that light still burns in practice rooms and concert halls, in dreams whispered and stages claimed. His voice echoes in every performer who stands where they supposedly don't belong, singing anyway, transforming the world one impossible note at a time. The standing ovation from that night has never truly ended. It simply found new hands to carry it forward into futures he helped create. What boundary in your own life needs challenging with the courage Sammy showed that night? Subscribe to discover more stories of artists who refused to accept the limits others placed on their dreams.